Welcome and thank you for joining the Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada presentation on the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, which will be referred to as CHIF for short throughout the presentation. This presentation focuses on the direct delivery stream, which was announced in October 2024. Let's get started. Today's presentation will provide an overview of the direct delivery stream of CHIF, its requirements, including eligibility criteria for applicants and projects, and how projects are assessed. I'll provide information on features specifically available to Indigenous applicants. We will also provide information on how to apply for funding, along with some tips and what you can expect after you submit an application. The Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund was announced in Budget 2024. It's a $6 billion fund intended to accelerate the construction and upgrading of housing enabling water, wastewater, stormwater, and solid waste infrastructure in order to provide the infrastructure needed to increase housing. An example of this would be bringing water pipes to a new subdivision to allow for housing to be built. For eligible Indigenous recipients only, projects that aim to preserve existing capacity or increase reliability and access to the above noted assets are also eligible. The fund has two streams. $5 billion is available under a provincial territorial agreement stream where HICC will provide funding to the PTs to distribute. Note that Indigenous projects are expected to be given due consideration by provinces and territories as part of this envelope, and that this has been communicated during PT negotiations. The other funding stream, which is the focus of today's webinar, is the $1 billion direct delivery stream. The direct delivery stream opened on November 7th and will remain open until May 19th, 2025 for Indigenous applicants. Please take note that submitted projects may be assessed at any time during the intake period, so applicants are encouraged to apply early if possible. Now, before we move into more details on the direct delivery stream, you may be wondering which funding stream you should apply to. We have heard and understand that Indigenous partners prefer working directly with the federal government to gain access to funding. However, you are eligible to apply for funding under either stream, so you can choose to apply to whichever stream you prefer. To help you determine which stream is best suited for you, there are a few things to consider. For instance, if your project is almost ready to start construction and can be completed by September 2031, and if your project is necessary to address pressing infrastructure needs that will allow for more housing to be developed, the direct delivery stream could be right for you. If you need more time to plan and design your project, or your project exceeds $100 million, or if you need more time to complete your project, the PT agreement stream may be a better option. And finally, please note that although a project can apply to both funding streams, it cannot receive CHIF funding from both the direct delivery and PT streams. To learn more about the PT agreement stream, I'd encourage you to check out the CHIF in Province and Territories section of our website. In designing the CHIF program, HICC adapted some program features to help address the unique needs of Indigenous communities. Some of these features include an expanded list of eligible project objectives. For example, projects do not need to enable more housing to be eligible, provided they are for pressing infrastructure needs. Additionally, the housing conditions do not apply to Indigenous-led projects, and there is no minimum project costs. Keep in mind, as with all projects, those that are the most meritorious will be recommended for approval. Under CHIF, Indigenous recipients are eligible for up to 100% cost sharing of total eligible costs. And finally, certain legal costs are also eligible for Indigenous recipients only. Now let's move on to eligibility. Eligible Indigenous applicants include an Indigenous governing body, such as a band council, a First Nation, Inuit, or Métis government or authority, a not-for-profit organization whose central mandate is to improve Indigenous outcomes, or an Indigenous Development Corporation. I invite you to take a look at the Before You Apply guide for Indigenous applicants for a more detailed explanation of each of the eligible recipients. This next slide focuses on eligible projects. Both capital and planning projects are eligible under CHIF. However, since the direct delivery stream is focused on projects with pressing needs and a high level of project readiness, we encourage you to submit planning projects to your province or territory under the PT agreement stream. In most cases, projects must enable housing. However, as I noted earlier, in considering the unique circumstances and needs of Indigenous communities, projects that aim to preserve existing capacity or increase reliability and access to drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, or solid waste infrastructure to improve services for current and/or future populations are also eligible. That said, please note that projects that enable development of needed housing supply may be prioritized. Before I go over a few examples of eligible projects, another important point on project eligibility relates to asset ownership. For a project to be eligible, the recipient must own the asset or have secured all necessary rights to it. To determine eligibility, you'll need to provide additional information in your application. For example, you'll need to show that public benefits exceed private benefits, and if applicable, information showing the investment is necessary for essential services. Now I'll go over a few examples of projects that would be eligible. The first type of project I'll highlight relates to drinking water systems. An eligible project could include the development or expansion of a water treatment facility, storage assets, pump stations, or cisterns. A project can include assets like water trucks. Please keep in mind that the most meritorious projects are commended for approval and that projects may be prioritized based on their ability to meet the core housing-based objectives of the program. Another example of a potentially eligible project is a solid waste project. These include the development or expansion of a landfill, a project that diverts waste from a landfill to increase its lifespan, or a project that relates to the rehabilitation of an existing landfill to improve safety and capacity. A third type of eligible project under CHIF includes stormwater infrastructure. An example would be a project that increases stormwater capacity, such as the use of dry ponds to reduce the amount of stormwater entering the water network. And finally, an example of wastewater or systems that could be eligible could include a lagoon system, utilidors, or septic pumping trucks. If you are unsure about the eligibility of your project, you can review additional information in the applicant guides or reach out to us by email. Now let's turn to eligible costs. Now, while there's a more detailed information in the application guide and step-by-step instructions on eligible costs, I want to highlight a few key points here. Number one, costs are only eligible after the project is approved and before September 30th, 2031. Unless those costs are related to environmental assessment, Indigenous consultation, climate resilience, and GHG mitigation, as those costs may be retroactively eligible. Number two, capital costs must be deemed direct and necessary for project implementation to be eligible. If you're unsure about a specific cost, you can email us for clarification. But keep in mind that we sometimes can't provide a concrete answer until the project application is being assessed. So to err on the side of caution, we recommend that you consider those costs you're unsure of as ineligible when determining funding requirements outside of CHIF. The third thing I wanted to highlight is that the only time land acquisition costs are eligible is for natural infrastructure. And fourth, with prior approval from HICC, there is potential for non-competitive contracting to be eligible. However, we won't be able to determine this until after projects are approved, and therefore potential recipients should not plan to have those costs included as eligible expenses. Now moving on to ineligible costs. Similar to the last slide, details on ineligible costs are available in our guides, but I wanted to take this time to remind you that costs associated with ongoing operations and maintenance are not eligible under CHIF. In addition, HICC will only reimburse eligible expenses agreed to in the contribution agreement. We will not pay for any cost overruns, meaning if the cost of the project increases above the amount specified in the agreement, those costs are not eligible and won't be reimbursed. As such, please carefully consider the guidance on contingencies and cost estimates in the step-by-step guide when budgeting for your project. Now, in terms of cost sharing, the maximum program cost share that CHIF may contribute towards a project is based on total eligible costs. And for Indigenous recipients, that would be up to 100% cost share. If you are receiving funding from other sources, please pay close attention to the stacking limits of each program, as the lowest is likely to apply. On that note, applicants who have applied for or received funding from any other program must disclose this information in the application form. On the next few slides, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about non-competitive contracting, employee salaries, and budgeting for your project. HICC requires recipients to undertake contracting in a way that is fair, transparent, competitive, and consistent with value for money principles, or in a manner otherwise acceptable. That said, we recognize the unique considerations and values of Indigenous communities and are committed to helping Indigenous applicants to build and keep knowledge in their community while making it easier for Indigenous partners to work with trusted partners. It is important to note that you must receive approval from HICC prior to planning for this, and it must be in the signed CA to be eligible. Non-competitive contracting is when a contract is awarded to one contractor without going through a tender process where multiple contractors may bid on the contract. Additional support for the use of NCCs is available for Indigenous applicants. For example, in most cases, recipients would require approval from the central agencies. However, for Indigenous recipients, the minister can approve these as indicated on the slide and in our guides. The second type of potentially eligible cost that warrants a brief description is what we call own forced labor. This is when the recipient uses its employee to conduct the work. So in order for expenses related to recipient employee costs to be considered eligible, you'll need to show that it's not economically feasible to tender a contract and that the costs incurred are directly associated to the work in question. You will also be required to provide information such as a breakdown of employees and related costs, details on why it's needed, and what other options were considered. To err on the side of caution, we recommend that when budgeting, you assume the costs associated with own forced labor and non-competitive contracting are not eligible. You should also be aware that obtaining approvals can take significant time, and it is likely to cause delays to your project start date, which is important when considering contingency funding when preparing your project budget. On that note, let's look at some budgeting considerations on the next slide. Budgeting for your project is an important aspect of your funding request, as we're unable to cover cost overruns. To avoid challenges, we urge you to think about all eligible components of the project. If you forget something, you will be required to cover it. The funding determination is based on total eligible project costs, not total costs. Now, we wanted to take a few minutes to let you know about the potential for HICC to advance payments to recipients. However, prior approval is needed and it is at their discretion. To receive approval, successful applicants will have to demonstrate the need by providing additional information, including financial statements and a detailed rationale. When advance payments are provided, they are made in installments through the duration of the project and based on cash flow needs, as detailed in the contribution agreement. Before considering a request for advance payments, please note that under CHIF, recipients can submit claims as often as they'd like throughout the program. and that claims can be submitted once the cost is incurred prior to it being paid. This is important as there's additional administrative requirements associated with installment-based advance payments. So now that we have covered finances and eligible costs, let's turn to federal requirements. There are a few things you should know about environmental assessment and Indigenous consultation requirements. Number one, not all projects will have an environmental assessment or Indigenous consultation requirement, but when they do apply, CHIF funding is contingent upon fulfilling the requirements. Number two, you may receive a request to provide additional information after you have submitted your application. The information provided to HICC will determine whether the project has federal environmental or impact assessment requirements under the Impact Assessment Act, modern treaties, or northern regulatory regimes. In terms of Indigenous consultation, the Government of Canada has a duty to consult and, where appropriate, accommodate Indigenous peoples when it contemplates a decision or activity that might adversely impact Aboriginal or treaty rights. We encourage all applicants to start a dialogue with Indigenous peoples potentially impacted by the project as early as possible. Finally, please remember that no construction can start and no funding can flow until environmental assessment and Indigenous consultation requirements are met, if applicable. The climate requirements under the CHIF program aim to help communities plan for and respond to the impacts of climate change and reduce greenhouse GHG emissions. CHIF climate resilience requirements support infrastructure designed to withstand future climate conditions by examining the project's exposure to climate hazards. These are flood, wildfire, extreme heat, permafrost, and thaw, and by integrating hazard treatment measures identified using the best available climate data and projections. You can learn more about possible climate requirements, including how to assess climate hazards and identify hazard treatment measures from Annex E of the step-by-step guide. Now let's quickly touch base on greenhouse gas emissions requirements in the next slide. CHIF supports GHG emissions reductions by requiring certain projects to include and report on GHG mitigation actions, where significant GHG emissions are expected. Examples include mechanical wastewater treatment plants over 10 million in total eligible costs, applicable solid waste projects such as landfills, organic waste processing, and thermal treatment, and anaerobic lagoons. Even where not a requirement, we highly recommend that all projects consider including GHG mitigation measures and identify those in the application. Part B and Annex E of the step-by-step guide provides a summary of requirements and additional tools for assessing and reporting on GHG emissions. Be aware that some federal requirements must be addressed in your application, while others come up later in project reporting. While not required for all projects, we highly recommend that all projects consider including GHG mitigation measures and include those in your application. The CHIF program also supports Canada's Buy Clean policy approach and requires qualifying projects to reduce emissions from ready-mix concrete. While Buy Clean requirements do not apply for Indigenous-led projects, we still recommend that all recipients consider GHG reduction measures in their projects. Before we carry on, please know that there is significant support available to all applicants to help with climate requirements. For example, HICC's Climate Toolkit for Housing and Infrastructure is a dedicated service where you can access guidance, resources, and information on best practices for incorporating climate resilience measures into projects. The link to the Climate Toolkit is on this slide, as well as information on how you can contact our Climate Help Desk. Now that we've gone over program requirements and eligibility, let's go over how your application will be assessed once it's submitted. Once we have received your application and have determined that a project is eligible, we will assess the project by looking at a number of factors, including the project rationale, how housing and/or infrastructure needs are addressed by the project, if applicable, as well as the urgency of the project and how soon it can start. In assessing projects led by an Indigenous applicant, HICC will take into account the unique circumstances, jurisdictional considerations, and differing priorities of many Indigenous communities. To that end, for questions that may not apply to the proposed project, such as those related to densification and support of known housing developments, it's perfectly acceptable to select unknown in the application form, and it won't impact the assessment. That being said, we would greatly appreciate if you can answer as many of those questions as possible, even where information is incomplete, as it will give us a better understanding of how the proposed project and its impacts. This slide provides a quick overview of some key things you'll need to apply, as well as some other resources to help with your application. First and foremost, carefully look at your project and ensure both the project and recipient are eligible. Second, you'll need a KML file. To create this file, consult Annex B of the step-by-step guide. It provides a very detailed description on all the steps needed. Third, carefully consider budget details and contingencies. And finally, note that in some cases, letters of support are required as part of your application. In terms of additional resources that may be helpful with your application, there are a few listed on the right-hand side of this slide. While housing needs assessments are not required for communities smaller than 30,000, there are a number of great tools that can help communities to consider housing needs through the Housing Assessment Resource Tools linked here. I recommend you check it out, as well as the Climate Help Desk and information on GBA Plus to support your application. And finally, we've reached the most important slide. How can you apply for CHIF funding? First, head to our website. There you will find the applicant guides and instructions on how to register for an account and access the application portal. Take some time to explore the portal and consult the step-by-step application instructions, which can be found in the portal when completing your application. These instructions are a helpful companion document to consult as you answer questions in the application form. For example, when rating the condition of your asset, you can find guidelines to help you distinguish between poor, very poor, and fair condition ratings. If after reviewing these documents you still have questions, please don't hesitate to send us an email at the address on the slide. A note about the funding portal. There may be some downtime in the portal needed to bring other programs online. If you see a notification to that effect, please save your info separately and simply try again the following day. If you experience persistent or prolonged technical difficulties, please contact us at the email on the screen. Also, for first-time users, once you create your account, you'll need to sign out and sign back in for full functionality. When submitting a project for funding via the HICC funding portal, it's important to note that the person registering for the account becomes the primary contact. This person and the person submitting the application must be employees or officers of the applicant Indigenous governing body who are duly authorized to submit the application on behalf of the applicant organization, attest that the application is complete, accurate, true, and reliable, and that it complies with CHIF criteria. A secondary contact may be a third party engaged in support in the completion of the application. This person has to be given permission from the primary contact in order to be able to fill out an application in the funding portal. For more information on account management, please consult Managing Permissions Account Administrator page within the portal. This slide has a few pointers to keep in mind while completing an application. First, we recommend that you begin your application as soon as possible. You can save it and return to it as many times as you need before submitting. Second, make sure that you answer the questions with specific, detailed, accurate, and clear information. Remember, showcase your project and its benefits. Assessors can only see what's in your application. And third, all contracts must be awarded in a way that is fair, transparent, competitive, and consistent with value for money principles. If there's a situation where this is not possible, please consult the applicant guide to understand requirements before including it as an eligible cost. Obtaining necessary approvals for non-competitive contracts can be a lengthy process that may take several months. Now I will go over some timelines and what you can expect after you submit your application. What to expect after you submit your application. Applications that are deemed to meet the eligibility requirements move on to the merit assessment. This is where you might hear back from us for additional information related to federal requirements or if we have any questions. Based on the results of the merit assessments, CHIF will recommend projects for funding and communicate the decisions as soon as possible. Each applicant will be informed about the results of their project application. So until you hear from us, you can assume that your project is still under consideration. For projects that are selected, they will receive an approval in principle letter signed by the minister and a letter from our EAIC team if there are federal requirements related to environmental assessment or Indigenous consultation. It is at this stage that requests for approval for the use of non-competitive contracting, own forced labor, or advance payments should be made. If after having read the guide and seeing this presentation, you still have questions, please feel free to email our CHIF general inbox at the address on the screen. Thank you for your interest in CHIF and good luck with your application.